Hi, this is my presentation for Lossography or Deathography. For this paper and presentation, I have reflected on experiences that took place in my childhood and during my adolescence, which I'm still in right now, um, and looked at the experiences I've had involving death and loss and grief, and seeing how those experiences have shaped the beliefs, attitudes, and values that I have about death and dying today. My first personal experience with death happened when I was 4. This one I do remember quite clearly. My family, we had an outside dog. Her name was Lexi. She was a Rottweiler. She was more of a guard dog. And she was old. I had known that she was about 12 or so when I was 4. And when you're little, I guess you can acknowledge that things are old, but you never really think that old things, animals, or even people are ever gonna die. They're just gonna always stay old, and that was my idea when it came to our dog. Even though I knew she was older, she wasn't gonna pass away. So one day I was watching TV. I was watching a movie, and my grandma came in. She had told me she was gonna go feed the dog, and she came back in and she asked me if I had wanted to see a dead animal. And growing up, I grew up in the north woods of Wisconsin, so hunting deer, even bears, badgers. I had seen all of these animals stuffed. I had seen deer mounted on walls. I had even seen bears. My grandparents had some mounted in their living room. So I had seen these things regularly, and I was really confused as to why she was asking me if I would want to see a dead animal. I saw them occasionally. And so I told her no. And then, as every 4-year-old has to ask, I asked why. And she told me that our dog had died. I do remember crying over that and just wondering why and how this could happen. But like I said, when you're 4, you never think that the things that are old are actually going to pass away. So from the time I was young, I was raised in church, and in Sunday school, they taught us if you believe in Jesus, you get to have eternal life, and when you die, you're gonna spend eternity with Him in heaven. Um, and so some weeks I went to the Baptist church with my grandma, and other weeks I went to the Catholic church across town with my other set of grandparents. And so when I was little, I had this idea of heaven that it was just there were lots of golden caskets and there were people lying in them, and they were glowing and they were wearing these flowing robes, and that there were just all these people laying there. And I had an uncle who had passed away before I could remember, and I'd seen pictures of him. He had passed away from cancer, and so I just imagined him laying in one of these caskets, bald, with his flowing robes and glowing face. And that's what I thought heaven was at age 4 and 5. Um, and then when I was 5 years old, I did live with my grandparents growing up until like ages 3 to 5. So when I was 5 years old, the grandpa that I lived with died. And I do not remember a single detail about that entire experience. His death, my grandma telling me he died. I don't remember a funeral or the adjustment period to life without him. I don't remember any of this. So even though I don't have a memory of what that period of grief was like, I'm sure that, it had hit me and that I experienced it, because my grandpa and I were very close. I remember I have lots of fond memories with him, fishing, and, he taught me how to grill when I was 4, and we spent a lot of time together, but I do not remember a single detail about his death. And so when I was 5, my grandpa joined my idea of heaven as the glowing people lying in their golden caskets, but he wasn't wearing the robes. He was wearing what I usually saw him in. So he changed my idea of heaven in that way. But then years had passed, and no one that I knew, no one that I was close with died. And still, I did not remember the death of my grandpa. So the only personal death experience I had up until that point was the dog, because that was the only thing I remembered. No one in my family died for many years. And then from the time I was 5, growing up, my thoughts on what afterlife was changed drastically. I read the Bible for myself, and I knew what it took to be given the gift of eternal life. And so I no longer pictured my grandpa in heaven because I wasn't even sure if he was there. And these thoughts probably grew when I was probably around 11 and 12. I really began to question. I was like, I don't even imagine him in this way anymore because I don't know if I could say that he was there for certain. My grandma took me to church, but he had never gone to church his entire life. He refused to go with my grandma. And my grandma would read me Bible stories, but he was never around when this happened. My grandma and I prayed. I don't really remember him taking part in that with us, but so I couldn't say for certain if he was in heaven because I acknowledged that hell was an afterlife as well. So during that period, probably around age 11, 12, I began to believe that hell was a part of afterlife as well. And then when I was 12 years old, my mom had a good friend. She would come over, they would have tea, they would go out shopping together, stuff like that. And I saw her regularly. She was one of my mom's good friends. She had 3 children and was pregnant with her 4th. There was no concern throughout her pregnancy. I remember this. No one was concerned about anything happening. And then I remember we were on a trip. My family was on a trip, and we had stopped at a hotel. And just before we were all getting into bed, my mom got a text, and her good friend had passed away during labor. And it was such a shock to everyone because, like I said, her pregnancy was going perfectly smooth. And I just remember the shock on my mom's face, and even the shock that I felt, even though I wasn't close with her. She wasn't, an everyday part of my life, but to know that someone that I knew was just gone just like that with no warning. There was nothing before that was letting us know that, hey, she might not make it through this. It was just a very sudden thing. And I feel like I was just absolute disbelief. I could not believe that had happened. And I didn't accept it immediately. I was just like, I saw her a week and a half ago at the grocery store. So how could she be dead? It just didn't feel real. And I feel like for a while I didn't accept that she was dead until a couple of years later I saw her husband had remarried, and I was just like, even then I was still like, this is insane. Like, she's actually gone. So I feel like that kind of gave me a glimpse into, I can't imagine what her family felt like, and that gave me a glimpse into just how real death really is. We have no control over it. We don't know when it's going to happen, but you can't turn back time to get her back. And so that was just crazy to me, and it was I guess a slap in the face of reality at age 12. And then from the time that I was 14 to 16, I had a great grandmother who had been diagnosed with MS decades ago. She was in a wheelchair my mom's entire life and my entire life, so I had never known her. I'd never seen her walk. But from the time I was 14 to 16, she had been going into the hospital, and she was, giving everyone in the family, she was scaring everyone because we thought she was on her deathbed multiple times. So when she was older, her hands, she couldn't move her hands. The MS had worked its way up from, she was paralyzed from the waist down, but then it was getting to her hands and her upper body. And that's why we all thought she was on her deathbed. She had bed sores, infections, and everything was just a mess for a couple of years. And my great-grandma was the type who would get angry if anyone ever brought up religion or church, and that was the only reason that I really didn't want her to die. I knew she was in pain. I knew that she was suffering, but I didn't want her to die because for the sole reason that I knew that she wasn't saved. And so for those 2 years, she scared everyone. We all thought she was on her deathbed, and then I saw her 7 months before she died, and she had lost a lot of weight. She seemed very pale, and it seemed like half of her was already gone. Like if she would have died the next day, I wouldn't have been surprised. She already looked honestly half dead. And that's, even though she wouldn't die for the next 7 months, I still feel like that's the closest that that's the most, that was my experience seeing someone who was dying, I would say. 7 months later, when my great grandma finally did die, I was conflicted on my feelings because on one side I knew that she was no longer bound to a wheelchair. She wasn't able to use her hands, and towards the end of her life, she could hardly even eat. So she wasn't able to do anything. She used to love to crochet and knit and read and play cards, and by the end of her life, she was just in bed doing nothing all day. And I knew that she wouldn't have these earthly things binding her anymore. But on the other side of that, it was like, well, where is she now? And if that was worse than her situation on Earth. I did not cry when my great grandma died. My family did drive up to Wisconsin where they were having a memorial, not a funeral, for her. And I remember sitting through the service, and I didn't cry throughout any of it. But then at the very end, my grandpa, her husband, stood up and thanked everyone for coming, and he started crying during that, and I just remember breaking down because it hit me. Not that it wasn't that she was dead; it was that I felt for him. I had empathy for him because, they were each other's world. He took care of her in her wheelchair for 35 plus years, and I knew how hard it was going to be for him to adapt, if he ever would, and get over that, and just to go on with his life. And I felt so sorry and so sad for him because they were in love and they were married for over 50 years. And so to know that he would have to deal with that, that just broke my heart. So I would say more than anything that my faith and being a Christian has established my beliefs for when it comes to death, including an afterlife. And not that, like, if my dad always tells me, he's a Christian, and he tells me if I die, I don't want you guys to be that upset. Like, yeah, I'll miss him physically, but I know that there's a lot more to our lives, our spiritual lives, than just being on this earth. And one day I'll see him again. So I know that humanly, my physical body will be sad, but spiritually, I'll see my family again. Reflecting back, I never really thought about what experiences have shaped my views on death. So I really thought that this was a good project, and I learned a lot about my beliefs, and I thought it was a good reflection project. Thank you.